welcome. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Yidinji, the Irriganji and the Gimoy Walbara peoples, who are the original owners of the land I'm speaking from today. I also want to acknowledge that that land was taken and never ceded, and that injustice is one that has been experienced by many Indigenous peoples of Australia today. Truth-telling requires us to recognise that in modern Australia, in order to experience reconciliation, all people must have access equitably to participate in the governance of the society in which they live. To this end, I support the Uluru Statement and commit to working with Australia's First Peoples so that all Australians may flourish. I pray that God will give us wisdom, creativity and courage as we undertake this process. Now, you would have heard our theme music at the beginning of the video. We Didn't Start the Fire by Billy Joel. So just to be clear, you're in the social justice elective. And if that's not where you're meant to be, well, it's too late, you're probably stuck here now. In a moment though, we're going to have a look at a couple of verses of scripture from the prophet Micah. But before we do, I want you to take about 2 minutes to share with your group what you think are some of the differences between fairness and justice. Listen out for Billy Joel, and when you hear his dulcet tones, you'll know you have about a minute to finish up and place your focus back on the screen and me. So go for it. people use to talk about a biblical perspective of social justice is Micah chapter 6, verse 8. Know, O people, the Lord has told you what is good, and this is what he requires of you, to do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. In short, the Hebrew peoples had already been told what was good. Now they were being told again what God requires of them in light of that. Micah is all about good governance, effective social policy, and social justice, because all of these things reflect God's character. He is faithful, he is merciful, and he is just. So what does this look like in society? Well, in every cultural group, there are three parts of society: welfare, policy, and justice. Now, they look quite different depending on the context, but they all exist together. And the easiest way to differentiate between them is by simple definition. You see, social welfare is the act of caring for someone who is disadvantaged. Social policy sets out an organisation or state's framework of how and who they're going to provide assistance to. And social justice? Well, social justice is what happens when those two things intersect. Now, I'm a picture person, and whether it's word pictures or actual art, I see it a bit like this. Micah lived over 2,000 years ago, long before Jesus, and yet his words have echoed through history and continue to resonate with us today. Micah lived during the time of the Hebrews' escape from Egypt and slavery, and is believed to have been active during Hezekiah's reign, just for the history buffs. In the first part of his writings, he laments the corrupt governance and leadership of his people, and he speaks really strongly against leadership that exercises the kind of justice that favours the wealthy, and yet deprives the poor of their land, their security, and their hope. It's reconciliation this week, and I have to say I can't help but think of the parallels to our own not-so-distant history. Not only was this leadership unjust, it violated the social policy set out in the Torah. Specifically, that families were not to be forced to sell their land to pay their debts, because otherwise they had no ability to survive. The worst part of that is that leaders did it because they could. They had the power and they used it. But throughout Micah, we read God promises to judge and to punish the Hebrew leaders for the mistreatment of the disadvantaged in their community. Now, these weren't just biblical political leaders. These were people with wealth, education, and influence. It's been said many times in different ways that societies who don't look after their poor are doomed to destruction. Micah too asserts that unjust economic practices will destroy the nation. You now have an opportunity to discuss to what extent you believe that to be true. What does that look like in a modern global context? Do you see it in our Australian society? What does it look like here? And remember, when you hear Billy, you'll have a minute or two to finish your thoughts and bring your focus back to the screen. Unfortunately, Micah doesn't leave it there. There is always hope. God is always faithful. And in the second part of the book, we read that Jerusalem is set up for as a place for all nations, and it's associated with peace and prosperity. In Micah 3 verse 8, Micah, filled with the power, the Spirit of the Lord, and with justice and strength, calls the nations back to a place of integrity. And in Micah 4 and 5, God promises a time of peace and prosperity, a time of collaboration and cooperation. Now, it's not a time of perfection, but the remnant, those who are left, will be purified and made useful. And then in Micah 6, we see the people's response to God. They ask the question, how can we repay God for his enduring faithfulness? And this is where we read our focus verse. The Lord has told you what is good, and this is what he requires of you: to act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. So what does that look like in the modern context of the Salvation Army? Well, I'm going to share a little bit of how we do things in my own context, homelessness, because it's built around this framework. So acting justly means helping all people to build their capacity. It doesn't mean doing it for them. It means supporting them with time, attention, resources, so that they can do it themselves. Walking humbly with God means acknowledging his sovereignty, his creativity, and my place in that. It means understanding that you are the expert on you. I don't have the answers you need, but there's a good chance that you do. So walking humbly means listening to understand rather than to simply respond or to gather information. It means maintaining a healthy curiosity when we're tempted to make negative assumptions about people and their motives. It means helping people to identify the obstacles that stop them from flourishing and working with them to reduce them, not simply trying to take them away ourselves, because you don't build resilience by not flexing your bounce back muscles. Loving mercy means increasing support when people let themselves down. It means looking for and sometimes creating the way back for people who feel like there's no coming back from their own destructive cycles. In some circles, that's been referred to as holding hope for people. So what does this look like in your context? Where are you placed in your community where you could help to raise someone's capacity? Is there a time when you've tried to fix someone rather than supporting them to realize their own resilience? What happened? When do you think we write people off in the Salvation Army? What could we do differently in those spaces? You see, there's always risk involved in this. But I want us to think about how we can manage that so that we can still be effective in this ministry space. Once again, Billy will tell you when it's time to come back, but you've got a bit longer to discuss this one, so dig in. time together today, I want to hone in on how we lead from a social justice perspective. You see, we are all leaders in one space or another because we all have influence. Keeping in mind the discussion you've just had, I want us to think about how we bring social justice into our own congregations with people who may be experiencing disadvantage of some kind. To begin with, it's useful to survey our scope of influence and to recognise individuals or groups who are part of our community, our church, our business, our sporting groups, our schools, anyone who may experience disadvantage. This might be due to barriers created by things like linguistic diversity, varied abilities, negative assumptions we or other people hold about people's abilities or identity. For example, ideas about age, gender, sexuality, education, employment, just to name a few. Once we've done this, we then need to take inventory of our own limitations. What don't we know? What skills do these people have that we actually might benefit from? Is it really a capacity issue, or is it a confidence and opportunity issue? Always reflect back. What assumption am I making? What supports and resources and policies are already in place that I can lean on? And finally, collaborate with the people who are disadvantaged and get creative so that they can fully participate in whatever context you're looking at, and in a way that is meaningful for them. During the next 5 minutes, just on your own, I want you to look at the places where you have influences, the places where you lead in one way or another. Survey your community. Choose a disadvantaged group. Write down some of the obstacles you think they may experience. Come up with a method to engage with that group to find out the extent to which your assumptions are correct. It might be a conversation or a survey. Get curious. What questions could you ask so that you understand the best ways to help build their capacity, or the best ways to increase their opportunity to experience, or the best ways to just create opportunity for them to participate? So to finish off, we're going to finish with a story that I've lifted from the New Testament. It's traditionally known as the parable of the Good Samaritan, but today we're going to use it as a bit of a self-assessment. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to identify yourself in the story, but I want you to think about what you've learned today. I want you to think about the things you've been reminded of today. And I want you to think about the differences between social policy, social welfare, and social justice. Okay, so a man was walking along the street late at night in a bit of a rough neighbourhood. A group of people stopped him, demanded his phone and wallet, and shoved him to the ground. So basically he couldn't give chase, and then they all took off. While it was still dark, the next morning a jogger saw him lying on the street. They crossed to the other side of the road, just kept riding and jogging. Just on daybreak, somewhere on their way to work, saw the man lying on the ground. They stopped to see if he was conscious. He mumbled that he was, and the employee kept hurrying along. Finally, another person came along. By now the day was getting hotter, and the injured man was sitting up. The person knelt down to speak with the man, and then after a short conversation helped him up. They made their way to the hospital, where the man's wounds were taken care of, and the person who helped eventually took him back to his family, who by this time were pretty worried. Now this is a great story. It's a story of social welfare, helping that comes out of compassion. But there's no social policy here, so it's not social justice. Now I'm not encouraging anyone to add to scripture, but how could the next part of the story, if we were to tell what happened next, play out? What would turn this story into a story of social justice? Have a think about that for the next 30 seconds, and then Billy's going to bring us back. I hope you had some ideas about things like increasing safety on the street. But I also hope that you thought about the people that committed the crime and the neighbourhood they were in. Perhaps you thought about finding out why they were disadvantaged and resorted to stealing. You might have asked yourself how you could engage with them to support them to make different choices. You probably thought about what government could do in that space to make the neighbourhood safer and to increase the quality of life for the people who live there. See, all of these things and many more, I'm sure, were part of your conversations. And they not only reflect an understanding of social justice, but its application. So, I want to say a big thank you for being part of this today. I really pray that God will bless you with eyes to see, with an intellect to choose, and with a heart that will settle for nothing less than justice. There's a big world out there, and there's lots to be done. So God bless you in the doing.